Every parent's worst nightmare is losing their child to the streets. 13-year-old Miriam Tate was already lost. Hungry, homeless, wandering the harsh southwest with only her loyal mutt, Biscuit, for companionship. When Biscuit dug up an old weathered map near an abandoned train stop, desperate Miriam followed it deep into the unforgiving desert. She found a hidden cave filled with more than just rumors of lost gold. Inside were personal journals and precious belongings of black miners who had fled west during Reconstruction, brave men whose incredible stories had completely vanished from history. Decades later, Miriam returns to preserve their forgotten memory and heal her own deep wounds. But what was the real treasure she discovered in that mysterious desert cave? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The leather journal trembled in Miriam's weathered hands as she sat in her modest Phoenix apartment, surrounded by boxes of research and faded photographs. At 67, she had learned that some memories never fade. They just burrow deeper, waiting for the right moment to surface. The journal's pages, yellowed and brittle, contained the cramped handwriting of her 13-year-old self, documenting a summer that had shaped everything that followed. Outside her window, the Arizona desert stretched endlessly toward the horizon, much as it had 43 years ago when she had wandered those same lands as a frightened, hungry child. The irony wasn't lost on her that she now lived comfortable and secure in the very landscape that had once threatened to claim her life. She opened the journal to the first entry, dated June 15th, 1974. The words, written in pencil that had smudged, with time and tears, transported her back to a world where every day was a battle for survival. Mama's been gone 3 days now. Don't know if she's coming back this time. Biscuit keeps looking at the door like he expects her to walk through. He's smarter than me. At least he stopped hoping. Miriam closed her eyes, remembering the cramped trailer park in Tucson where she had spent the early years of her adolescence. Her mother, Sarah Tate, had been a woman caught between worlds, too proud to accept help, too broken to provide stability. The death of Miriam's father in Vietnam had shattered something fundamental in Sarah's spirit. She'd drift in and out of their lives like tumbleweeds, disappearing for days or weeks at a time, leaving Miriam to fend for herself. The trailer park had been a collection of aluminum dreams deferred, where families clung to the edges of society. Most of the residents were decent people working multiple jobs just to keep the lights on. But there were others, men who looked at a young girl with eyes that made her skin crawl, women so lost in their own pain that they couldn't see a child in need standing right beside them. Biscuit had arrived during one of her mother's longer absences, a scrappy mutt of indeterminate breeding who had simply appeared one scorching morning, panting in the shade of their trailer's awning. He was mostly terrier, Miriam had guessed, with patches of brown and white fur that looked like someone had splashed paint on him. His left ear had been torn in some long-ago fight, giving him a permanently quizzical expression that had instantly endeared him to her lonely heart. "You hungry too, boy?" she had whispered that first morning, sharing the last of her cereal with him. He had looked at her with such gratitude, such absolute devotion, that she knew they were meant to be together. In a world where everyone seemed to leave, Biscuit had chosen to stay. The journal entries painted a picture of increasing desperation as the summer of 1974 wore on. Sarah's absences grew longer, the money ran out, and the landlord's patience evaporated like water on hot asphalt. Miriam had learned to shoplift food with the skill of a professional, to avoid the authorities who would separate her from Biscuit, to sleep with one eye open in case the wrong person came knocking. July 4th, 1974. Ironic date for independence. Mrs. Henderson from the office came by again asking about Mama, told her she was at work. Don't think she believed me. Biscuit and me ate cold beans from a can for dinner. At least we're together. The Southwest in the 1970s had been a harsh place for a young black girl on her own. The civil rights movement had made legal changes, but hearts and minds moved slower than legislation. In truck stops and small towns, Miriam had encountered stares that ranged from suspicious to outright hostile. She had learned to make herself invisible, to slip through crowds like a shadow, to trust only Biscuit's instincts about which people might help and which might harm. She had developed survival skills that no child should need to learn. She knew which restaurants threw away food that was still edible, which gas stations had unlocked bathrooms, which parks were safe to sleep in, and which were prowled by predators. She had memorized the schedules of social workers and truant officers, staying one step ahead of a system that would see her as a problem to be processed rather than a child to be protected. But it was more than just physical survival that had shaped her during those months. The constant uncertainty had forged something unbreakable in her spirit, a resilience that would serve her well in the years to come. She had learned that she could endure far more than she ever imagined, that fear and courage could coexist, that sometimes the act of simply continuing to breathe was an act of rebellion against despair. Reading her own words now, Miriam marveled at the matter-of-fact tone her younger self had used to describe circumstances that would have broken many adults. Children, she reflected, possessed a remarkable ability to adapt, to find normalcy in the abnormal, to create family from the most unlikely companions. July 20th, 1974. Biscuit's been acting strange lately, keeps whining and scratching at the ground behind the old train depot. Maybe he smells something dead, or maybe he's going crazy, like everyone else around here. Miriam smiled despite herself. Even then, Biscuit had been trying to tell her something important. Animals possessed instincts that humans had forgotten, connections to the land and its history that civilization had severed. She had dismissed his behavior as the quirks of a restless dog, never imagining that he was leading her toward a discovery that would change everything. The train depot that Biscuit had been so interested in had been abandoned for decades, a relic from the days when the railroad companies had carved their way across the desert, bringing progress and prosperity to some while displacing others. It sat on the outskirts of town, slowly being reclaimed by the desert, walls crumbling, tracks buried under sand and scrub brush. Local kids whispered stories about the place, tales of ghosts and buried treasure that had probably been embellished with each telling. But Miriam had always been drawn to it, not by the stories, but by the silence. In a world full of noise and chaos, the abandoned depot offered a kind of peace, a place where she and Biscuit could rest without being watched or judged. She had spent countless hours there during that desperate summer, reading books stolen from the library, writing in her journal, dreaming of a life beyond survival. The depot had become their sanctuary, their secret place where the future seemed possible and the past couldn't quite reach them. The journal entries from late July showed her growing desperation as their situation deteriorated. The money was completely gone, the trailer park manager was threatening eviction, and social services was closing in. She had been facing the terrible choice between the foster care system that would separate her from Biscuit and the unknown dangers of complete homelessness. July 28, 1974. Packed everything we own in Mama's old backpack. If we're going to be homeless, might as well be homeless somewhere beautiful. Biscuit agrees. He's been staring at the horizon like he can see something I can't. Maybe he can. The decision to leave had been equal parts desperation and determination. She couldn't stay in Tucson. There were too many people asking too many questions, too many systems designed to process her rather than help her. The desert called to her with its promise of space and solitude, its indifference to human struggles that somehow felt more honest than the false concern of bureaucrats. She had prepared as well as a 13-year-old could, stealing supplies from various stores, filling water bottles, packing the few possessions that mattered. The backpack had been heavy with hope and fear in equal measure, weighted down with the essentials of survival and the treasures of childhood that she couldn't bear to leave behind. Biscuit had seemed to sense the importance of their departure. His usual playful energy had been replaced by a focused intensity, as if he understood that they were embarking on more than just another adventure. He had stayed close to her side, alert and protective, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Now, decades later, Miriam understood that the journey they had begun that day had been about more than escape. It had been a pilgrimage of sorts, a quest for belonging that would lead them to a discovery that transcended their personal struggles. The desert that had seemed so empty and hostile had been hiding stories, preserving memories, waiting for the right person to uncover its secrets. She closed the journal and reached for the phone, dialing a number she had memorized weeks ago. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the historian from Arizona State University, who had been so enthusiastic about her story, answered on the second ring. "Dr. Martinez, this is Miriam Tate. I've made my decision. I want to move forward with the Heritage Site project." The excitement in the historian's voice was palpable. "Miriam, that's wonderful news. When do you want to make the trip back to the site?" Miriam looked out at the desert, where the setting sun was painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "As soon as possible. It's time to honor their memory properly." After she hung up, Miriam sat in the gathering darkness, holding the journal that had preserved her 13-year-old voice. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of returning to the place that had changed her life. She would face the memories, both painful and precious, that she had carried for so many years. But tonight, she would remember Biscuit's excitement on that long-ago morning when he had found something buried in the sand, something that would prove to be far more valuable than gold. The August sun had barely cleared the horizon when Biscuit began his frantic digging behind the abandoned train depot, his paws sending clouds of red dust into the still morning air. Miriam watched from her usual spot against the depot's crumbling wall, too tired and hungry to care much about whatever had captured her dog's attention. They had spent another sleepless night dodging the security guard's flashlight, and her stomach felt like it was eating itself from the inside out. "Quit making such a racket," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the main road. "You want everyone in town knowing we're here?" But Biscuit was possessed by some primal urgency, digging deeper and faster than she had ever seen him move. His usual playful demeanor had been replaced by intense focus, his torn ear twitching with each movement. Whatever he sensed down there, it was important enough to ignore her commands, and Biscuit never ignored her commands. The hole grew wider and deeper as the morning heat began to build. Miriam found herself drawn closer despite her irritation. Curiosity overcoming exhaustion, Biscuit's claws scraped against something hard, producing a metallic ring that echoed strangely in the desert silence. "What you got there, boy?" She knelt beside him and brushed away the loose sand with her hands. Her fingers touched something cold and unforgiving, a piece of rusted metal embedded in the hard-pan clay. Working together, they managed to pry it loose from the earth's grip. It was a railroad spike, corroded and pitted by decades of desert weather, but still recognizable as a piece of the infrastructure that had once connected this forgotten place to the wider world. Miriam turned the spike over in her hands, feeling its substantial weight. It was the kind of thing that railroad crews would have driven into wooden ties to hold the steel rails in place, a tiny but essential piece of the great machine that had carried people and dreams across the continent. But this depot had been abandoned long before she was born. Why would a railroad spike be buried so far from the actual tracks? Biscuit had resumed his digging, having moved on from the spike to something else hidden in the hard-packed earth. This time his claws caught the edge of something that crinkled, a sound that made Miriam's heart race with possibility. Paper meant writing, and writing might mean information, and information was the most valuable currency a girl in her situation could hope to find. What emerged from the ground was a piece of oiled cloth wrapped around something rectangular and flat. The cloth was old beyond measure, stained with earth and time, but it had done its job of protecting whatever lay inside. Miriam's hands shook as she carefully unwrapped the bundle, revealing a piece of parchment that was yellow with age and brittle as autumn leaves. It was a map. Even at 13, with limited education and no experience with cartography, Miriam could recognize the hand-drawn landmarks and rough compass directions that marked this as someone's careful attempt to record a specific location. The paper was covered with crude but detailed drawings, a distinctive rock formation that looked like a sleeping giant, a dry creek bed that curved like a question mark, a stand of cottonwood trees arranged in what appeared to be a rough circle, but it was the writing that made her heart stop. In faded ink, someone had written words that seemed to glow with possibility. Cave entrance behind third tree from north. Water inside. Safe shelter. Gold mine deeper in. God willing, we made it. The signature at the bottom was barely legible, but she could make out what looked like J. Washington, 1871. Miriam stared at the map until her eyes began to water, hardly daring to believe what she was seeing. A gold mine, an actual gold mine, with water and shelter, hidden somewhere in the desert that stretched endlessly beyond the depot. It sounded too good to be true, too much like the fairy tales that desperate people told themselves to get through another day. But then she looked at Biscuit, who was sitting perfectly still beside her, his intelligent brown eyes fixed on the map as if he could read it too. There was something in his expression, a certainty almost, that made her wonder if he had been leading her to this discovery all along. She examined the map more carefully, trying to match the drawings to the landscape she could see from the depot. The rock formation that looked like a sleeping giant was visible in the distance, maybe 10 miles to the west. She had noticed it before during their wanderings, thinking it looked like something from a dream or a story her father used to tell. The more she studied the map, the more real it seemed. The details were too specific to be imagination, too carefully rendered to be a child's fantasy. Someone had taken great care to record these landmarks, someone who had actually been to this place and wanted others to be able to find it again. The railroad spike made sense now, too. This depot would have been the last stop for supplies, the final connection to civilization before heading into the vast unknown of the desert. Someone, this J. Washington, had marked this spot as a reference point, burying the map here for safekeeping or perhaps for others who might follow. Miriam tried to imagine the person who had created this map. A black man, based on the name, venturing into the desert in 1871. That would have been during Reconstruction, when newly freed slaves were spreading across the country in search of opportunities and safety. The gold rushes had drawn people of all backgrounds west, but few of their stories had been preserved in the history books she had read. The thought that this map might be authentic, that it might lead to an actual discovery, was almost too overwhelming to process. Her entire life had been defined by scarcity of food, of safety, of hope. The possibility that something valuable might be within her reach seemed to violate the natural order of things. But what choice did she have? The trailer park was no longer an option, and her mother's return seemed increasingly unlikely. The authorities were closing in, and winter would come eventually, bringing cold that could kill someone unprepared. She could try to make it on the streets of Tucson, dodging social services and surviving on scraps, or she could follow this map into the unknown. When she looked at it that way, the choice was obvious. She studied the landmarks again, memorizing their positions relative to each other and to the depot. The distance looked manageable, maybe a 2-day walk if they were careful with their water. She had been living on practically nothing for weeks. She could certainly survive a few more days on minimal supplies. Biscuit seemed to sense her decision. He stood up and walked a few steps toward the western horizon, then turned back to look at her expectantly. His message was clear. Whatever lay out there, they would face it together. Miriam carefully folded the map and tucked it into her backpack along with the railroad spike. She wasn't sure why she kept the spike, but something about its weight and solidity felt important, like a talisman connecting her to the person who had left this gift buried in the sand. As she shouldered her pack and called Biscuit to her side, Miriam felt something she hadn't experienced in months: genuine hope. Not the desperate optimism that came from having no other choice, but real hope based on possibility and purpose. The desert stretched before them, vast and intimidating, but no longer entirely unknown. Somewhere out there, if Jay Washington was to be believed, waited shelter and water and perhaps even treasure. More importantly, somewhere out there waited answers to questions she hadn't even known to ask. She took one last look at the abandoned depot, the place that had sheltered them during their darkest hours, and whispered a prayer of gratitude to whoever had thought to bury that map here. Then she turned her face toward the sleeping giant rock formation and began walking into a future that suddenly seemed full of possibilities. The broken compass had been her father's, one of the few things Miriam had salvaged from their trailer before beginning this journey. She pulled it from her pocket as they stood at the edge of the desert proper, watching its needle spin aimlessly around the face. The glass was cracked, probably from when she had dropped her backpack while fleeing a security guard 2 weeks earlier, and whatever internal mechanism that had once guided her father through the jungles of Vietnam had finally given up. "Well, that's just perfect," she muttered, giving the compass a frustrated shake. The needle continued its lazy dance, pointing everywhere and nowhere at once. Biscuit sat beside her, panting in the growing heat as they surveyed the landscape ahead. From their position on a small rise, the desert stretched endlessly westward, a sea of sand and scrub brush, broken only by distant mesas and the sleeping giant rock formation that served as their primary landmark. The terrain looked even more forbidding than it had from the depot, an alien landscape that seemed designed to swallow travelers without a trace. They had been walking for 6 hours since leaving the abandoned train station, following a rough bearing toward the distinctive rock outcropping. The early morning cool had given way to punishing heat that made the air shimmer like water. Miriam's clothes were already soaked with sweat, and they had barely begun their journey. She consulted the map again, trying to orient herself without the compass. The landmarks drawn by Jay Washington were detailed enough, but distances in the desert were deceiving. The sleeping giant looked close enough to touch, yet she knew from her father's stories about military navigation that desert air could make objects appear much nearer than they actually were. "Dad always said you can't trust your eyes out here," she told Biscuit, who tilted his head attentively. "Said the desert plays tricks on you, makes you see things that aren't there and miss things that are." The thought of her father brought a familiar ache to her chest. Staff Sergeant Robert Tate had been a man who understood survival, who had navigated hostile territory and brought his men home safely. If he were here now, he would know exactly how to read the terrain, how to conserve water, how to find shelter when the sun reached its brutal peak. But her father was buried in a military cemetery outside Tucson, and she was on her own with nothing but a 13-year-old's determination and a dog's unwavering loyalty. They resumed walking, Miriam checking the map every few hundred yards to confirm their heading. The landscape was more varied than it had appeared from a distance. Rocky washes cut through the sandy flats, creating natural corridors that offered some protection from the wind, but could also lead travelers astray. She found herself developing an appreciation for the map's creator, who had noted these features with careful attention to detail. The first real test of the map's accuracy came when they encountered the dry creek bed that curved like a question. A mark. According to Jay Washington's drawing, they should find this feature approximately 2 miles from their starting point, and there it was, exactly as depicted. The creek had been dry for decades, probably longer, but its banks were lined with deeper sand that retained moisture, supporting hardy desert plants that provided welcome shade. "Look at that, Biscuit," Miriam said, consulting the map with growing excitement. This guy knew what he was talking about. They followed the creek bed for half a mile, just as the map indicated, until they reached a point where it intersected with another wash coming from the north. Here, J. Washington had drawn a small circle with the notation, "Good camping, wind protection." The spot was perfect, a natural bowl in the landscape that would provide shelter from the desert winds while remaining hidden from casual observation. More importantly, Miriam found evidence that others had used this place before, half buried. In the sand were the remains of an old fire ring, stones carefully arranged in a circle and blackened by countless fires. She also found fragments of pottery and a few pieces of rusted metal that might once have been part of cooking implements. "People have been coming through here for a long time," she murmured, running her fingers over the smooth stones of the fire ring. The discovery was both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because it proved the route was viable. Unsettling because it raised questions about who else might be traveling these paths and why. Biscuit had discovered something too. He was sniffing around a cluster of rocks near the wash's edge, whining softly and pawing at the ground. When Miriam investigated, she found what appeared to be a deliberately constructed cairn, a small pile of stones that could serve as a trail marker. It was exactly the sort of navigation aid that experienced desert travelers would use to mark their passage for others. The afternoon sun was becoming dangerous, turning the desert into a furnace that could kill the unprepared. Miriam decided to make camp in the protected spot, following the wisdom of desert survival her father had taught her. Travel in the early morning and late afternoon. Rest during the heat of the day. Conserve water and energy for when you need the most. She shared half of her remaining water with Biscuit, rationing it carefully despite her raging thirst. The map indicated they should reach the cottonwood grove by the end of the next day, where J. Washington had noted a reliable water source. If the map was wrong about that detail, they would be in serious trouble. As they rested in whatever shade they could find, Miriam began to understand that this journey was testing her in ways she hadn't anticipated. The physical challenges were obvious: heat, thirst, exhaustion, the constant threat of getting lost. But there were psychological pressures too. The vastness of the landscape made her feel impossibly small, a tiny speck of life in an environment that was utterly indifferent to her survival. Yet there was something else, something harder to define. Following J. Washington's map felt like participating in a conversation across time, connecting with someone who had faced similar challenges and left behind guidance for those who would follow. Every landmark they reached, according to his drawings, was like receiving a message from the past, proof that she was not the first person to make this journey or face these fears. Biscuit seemed to sense the weight of what they were undertaking. His usual playful energy had been replaced by a focused seriousness that reminded Miriam of her father when he was concentrating on something important. The dog's instincts had led them to the map in the first place, and now those same instincts seemed to be guiding him through terrain that was as foreign to him as it was to her. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Miriam felt a strange sense of peace settle over her. Yes, they were alone in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Yes, they were following a map created by someone who might have died out here more than a century ago. But they were also part of something larger than themselves, participants in a story that had been unfolding long before they arrived and would continue long after they were gone. She pulled out her journal and began to write by the fading light, documenting their progress and her thoughts. Someday, she realized, someone else might find these words and draw strength from them, just as she was drawing strength from J. Washington's careful notations. The desert might be vast and uncaring, but it was also a repository of human stories, a place where courage and determination left marks that could guide future travelers. Tomorrow they would continue west, following the map toward the cottonwood grove and whatever lay beyond. Tonight, She would rest beside the fire ring where others had rested before her, watched over by the same stars that had guided countless journeys across this ancient landscape. The old canteen lay partially buried beneath a mesquite bush, its canvas covering bleached white by decades of desert sun. Miriam almost missed it entirely, might have walked right past if Biscuit hadn't stopped suddenly and begun pawing at the base of the thorny shrub. When she knelt to investigate, her fingers closed around metal that was still cool despite the morning heat. It was a military-style canteen, the kind her father had carried, but much older. The canvas cover was deteriorating, falling apart at her touch, but the metal container itself was intact. More importantly, it still held water, not much, maybe a quarter full, but the liquid inside looked clear when she held the canteen up to the light. "Someone left this here recently," she told Biscuit, unscrewing the cap and sniffing the contents. The water smelled clean, with only a slight metallic tang from the container. Or maybe this place stays shaded enough to preserve things. They had been walking for 3 hours since breaking camp at dawn, making good time across terrain that was becoming increasingly familiar. The landmarks from J. Washington's map continued to appear exactly where and when they should. A flat-topped butte, a distinctive cluster of saguaro cacti, a wash filled with white stones that gleamed like scattered bones in the morning light. Each confirmed landmark increased Miriam's confidence in the map's accuracy, but also deepened the mystery of its creation. The level of detail suggested someone who had traveled this route multiple times, not just a prospector making a single, desperate journey into the unknown. J. Washington had known this country intimately, well enough to note the best camping spots, the most reliable water sources, the easiest passages through difficult terrain. The canteen discovery added another layer to the puzzle. According to the map, they were still a full day's walk from the cottonwood grove where water was supposed to be available. Yet here was a water cache, positioned precisely where a traveler would need it most. Someone had been maintaining this route, ensuring that those who followed would have the resources to survive the journey. Miriam consulted her father's broken compass out of habit, then laughed at herself when the needle spun uselessly. She had been navigating by landmarks for 2 days now, and her confidence in reading the terrain was growing steadily. The sleeping giant rock formation was much closer now, its distinctive profile revealing details that hadn't been visible from the depot. She could make out what appeared to be a natural arch near its base, exactly as J. Washington had drawn it. The discovery of the canteen had lifted her spirits, but it also raised troubling questions. If someone was maintaining this route, where were they? Why hadn't she seen any sign of other travelers? The footprints around the last campsite had been old, weathered by wind and rain until they were barely visible. Yet the water in the canteen was fresh. Biscuit seemed less concerned with these mysteries than with the practical business of survival. He had developed an uncanny ability to find shade during their rest stops, to locate the occasional desert spring or seep that wasn't marked on the map, to sense when they needed to rest and when they could safely push forward. His torn ear gave him a permanently alert expression, as if he were constantly listening for sounds beyond human hearing. As the morning wore on, they began to encounter more signs of previous travelers. Stone cairns appeared at regular intervals, marking the trail with subtle but unmistakable guidance. Some were ancient, their stones darkened by desert varnish and scattered by time, while others looked relatively recent. The pattern suggested a route that had been used for generations, passed down through oral tradition or hand-drawn maps like the one she carried. The realization that she was following an established trail was both comforting and unsettling. Comforting because it meant she wasn't completely lost in the wilderness. Unsettling because it implied a purpose to the route that went beyond simple exploration. People didn't maintain desert trails without good reason. Water, shelter, trade routes, or something valuable enough to justify the risk and effort. By midday, the heat had become oppressive. forcing them to seek shelter beneath an overhanging rock formation. As they rested, Miriam studied the map more carefully, trying to understand the broader pattern of J. Washington's journey. The route avoided major towns and obvious roads, suggesting someone who preferred to travel unnoticed. It followed natural corridors and water sources, displaying intimate knowledge of desert survival. But there were other notations on the map that she was beginning to understand. Small symbols that might indicate danger, a crossed-out circle, near what appeared to be a military outpost, warning marks near certain towns. J. Washington hadn't just been seeking gold. He had been seeking safety, following a route that would allow him to avoid hostile encounters. The historical context was becoming clearer as well. 1871 would have been during Reconstruction, when newly freed slaves were spreading across the country in search of opportunities and safety. The West had promised freedom and prosperity, but it had also harbored dangers, hostile settlers, discriminatory laws, violence that could erupt without warning. A man like J. Washington would have needed more than courage to survive. He would have needed careful planning and detailed knowledge of safe routes through dangerous territory. The thought that she might be following an underground railroad of sorts, a path used by Black Americans seeking safety and opportunity in the post-Civil War West, gave new meaning to her journey. She wasn't just chasing treasure, she was retracing the steps of someone who had faced far greater challenges with far less support than she could imagine. As afternoon gave way to evening, they reached the cottonwood grove marked on the map. The trees appeared as a green smudge on the horizon, growing larger and more distinct as they approached. When they finally arrived, Miriam found a small oasis that seemed almost too perfect to be real. A natural spring surrounded by ancient cottonwoods whose leaves whispered in the evening breeze, but it was the evidence of human habitation that truly amazed her. Someone had built a small stone shelter against the hillside, carefully constructed to blend with the natural rock formations. A fire ring sat near the spring, blackened by countless fires and surrounded by flat stones that could serve as seats or work surfaces. Most tellingly, someone had carved symbols into the bark of the largest cottonwood, not names or dates, but geometric patterns that might serve as messages for those who knew how to read them. Biscuit drank deeply from the spring, while Miriam filled the old canteen and her own water bottles. The water was cold and sweet, tasting of minerals and stone. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to drink her fill, feeling strength return to her tired body. As darkness fell, she built a small fire in the ancient ring and opened her journal to record the day's discoveries. The route was real, the landmarks accurate, and the water sources reliable. Tomorrow, according to the map, they would reach the cave where J. Washington claimed to have found gold. But Miriam was beginning to suspect that the real treasure of this journey lay not in precious metals, but in the stories embedded in the landscape. Stories of courage and determination, of people who had risked everything for the chance at freedom and dignity. Stories that deserved to be remembered and honored, not lost to time and silence. She looked at Biscuit, who was already asleep beside the fire, his torn ear twitching as he dreamed of running through endless desert spaces. Tomorrow would bring answers to questions she was only beginning to understand. Tonight, she would rest beside the spring where others had rested before her, protected by the wisdom of those who had made this journey possible. The faded photograph lay face down on a natural stone shelf just inside the cave entrance, as if someone had carefully placed it there for safekeeping before stepping out for just a moment and simply never returned. When Miriam lifted it with trembling fingers, she found herself staring into the faces of 5 black men, their expressions serious and dignified, despite the crude frontier setting behind them. They stood in front of what appeared to be a cave she had just entered, though the landscape around it looked different, more verdant, with evidence of cultivation and careful tending. The men wore the rough clothing of miners and laborers, but their posture and bearing spoke of education and purpose. One held what looked like surveying equipment, another carried a leather satchel that might have contained documents or maps. But it was their eyes that captured Miriam's attention and held it. These were not the desperate, hunted expressions she might have expected from fugitives or fortune seekers. These men looked like they belonged here, like they had found exactly what they were looking for and intended to stay. She had discovered the cave entrance exactly where J. Washington's map indicated it would be, behind the third cottonwood from the north, concealed by a natural overhang that made it nearly invisible unless you knew precisely where to look. Biscuit had found it first, of course, disappearing into what appeared to be solid rock, until his excited barking drew her to investigate. The entrance was narrow and low, requiring her to crawl on hands and knees for the first few yards before opening into a chamber large enough to stand upright. Natural light filtered in through cracks in the ceiling, illuminating a space that was clearly much more than a simple cave or mine shaft. Someone had lived here. Multiple someones, based on the evidence scattered throughout the chamber. There were sleeping areas marked off with carefully arranged stones, each with its own collection of personal belongings. Cooking areas with blackened fire rings and collections of pots and utensils. Work areas where tools were neatly organized and projects lay half-finished, as if their owners had simply stepped away and planned to return. The photograph was just the beginning. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, Miriam began to catalogue the extraordinary collection of artifacts that filled the cave. There were books, actual books, wrapped in oiled cloth and stored in natural niches in the rock walls. Tools that showed the wear of daily use but were carefully maintained and organized. Personal items that spoke of lives lived with intention and hope. A straight razor and shaving brush, a well-worn Bible with pressed flowers marking certain passages, a set of tin dishes that had been polished until they gleamed. But it was the evidence of community that truly amazed her. This hadn't been a temporary shelter or desperate hideout. Someone, multiple someones, had created a home here, a place where people could live with dignity and purpose. There were signs of craftsmanship and industry, hand-carved furniture, carefully constructed storage areas, even what appeared to be a small workshop where metal tools had been repaired and maintained. Biscuit had disappeared deeper into the cave. System, his excited yips echoing from passages that extended far beyond the main chamber. When Miriam followed the sound, she discovered that the cave was actually a complex network of connected rooms and passages, some natural and others clearly excavated by human hands. The mining activity was evident deeper in the system. Carefully, shored passages, evidence of systematic excavation, even what appeared to be a small smelting area where ore had been processed. But this wasn't the desperate scratching of desperate men. This was the work of people who understood mining, who had the knowledge and tools to extract value from the earth safely and efficiently. In one of the deeper chambers, she found what appeared to be a meeting room or common area. Stone benches had been carved from the cave walls, arranged in a circle around a central fire pit. The walls were covered with carefully drawn maps and diagrams, some showing the local area in extraordinary detail, others depicting distant places that might have been homes left behind or destinations yet to be reached. It was here that she found the most extraordinary evidence of the cave's history. Someone had carved names and dates into the smooth stone wall, creating a record of those who had passed through or made this place their home. The earliest date she could make out was 1869, the latest 1876. Between those years, dozens of names had been recorded, each with careful attention to detail that suggested this was an important ritual, a way of marking presence and permanence in a world that often denied both to people like these. Many of the names were accompanied by brief notations. J. Washington. Arrived safely June 1871. Samuel Freeman found his calling here. Moses Brown, heading north with news. The wall told the story of a community that had existed in this hidden place, a refuge where people could rest, recover, and plan their next moves in safety. The photograph began to make sense now. These weren't desperate fugitives or simple prospectors. These were founders, creators of something significant and lasting. The serious expressions on their faces reflected the gravity of their undertaking, creating a safe haven in hostile territory, building something that could serve others who would follow. As she explored further, Miriam found evidence that the cave had served multiple purposes. There were areas that clearly functioned as workshops where various trades were practiced: blacksmithing, leatherworking, even what appeared to be a primitive printing press. These people hadn't just been hiding, they had been building, creating a self-sufficient community that could operate independently of the hostile world outside. The more she discovered, the more questions arose. How had they remained hidden for so long? How had they obtained supplies and materials? Most importantly, what had happened to them? The evidence suggested a thriving community that had simply vanished, leaving behind carefully preserved records of their existence, but no explanation for their departure. Biscuit's barking drew her attention to another discovery, a natural alcove that had been converted into what appeared to be a library and record-keeping area. Here, wrapped in oiled cloth and stored with meticulous care, were documents that would have been priceless to historians. Letters, newspaper clippings, legal documents, and what appeared to be multiple copies of maps showing safe routes and resources throughout the Southwest. But it was a particular bundle of letters that stopped her heart. They were addressed to J. Washington and appeared to be from family members and friends scattered across the country. The letters painted a picture of a network that extended far beyond this single cave, a system of communication and support that had connected isolated communities and helped coordinate movements and resources. One letter, dated 1872, contained a line that made Miriam's hands shake. "The children ask when you're coming home, but I tell them home is wherever you're safe to be, who God made you to be." She sat in the dusty cave, holding the photograph and surrounded by the carefully preserved evidence of lives that had been lived with courage and dignity in impossible circumstances. These people had created something extraordinary, not just a hiding place, but a beacon, a proof that freedom and community could exist even in the most unlikely places. The gold mine that had drawn her here seemed almost incidental now. The real treasure was the story itself, the evidence that people like her father had always existed, people who refused to accept the limitations imposed by others, who found ways to create meaning and purpose even in exile. As afternoon light slanted through the cave entrance, Miriam realized she was no longer just a desperate 13-year-old following a treasure map. She had become the keeper of secrets, the discoverer of stories that the world had forgotten or never known. The weight of that responsibility was both thrilling and terrifying. The hand-carved wooden cross hung from a leather cord beside what had clearly been someone's personal sleeping area, suspended from a natural stone projection that formed a perfect bedside alcove. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Whoever had carved it possessed real skill, transforming a simple piece of wood into something that radiated both artistry and deep faith. The cross showed signs of daily handling, its edges worn smooth by countless fingers seeking comfort and strength. Miriam touched it gently, then immediately pulled her hand back, feeling like she was intruding on something sacred. This wasn't just an artifact. It was someone's most treasured possession, left behind in what had clearly been their home. The sleeping area around the cross told the story of a life lived with intention and care, despite the harsh circumstances. A woolen blanket, still intact after all these years, was folded precisely at the foot of a sleeping pallet made from carefully woven rushes. A wooden crate served as a bedside table, holding a collection of personal items that painted a picture of daily life. A small mirror with an ornate handle, a comb carved from bone, a collection of smooth stones that might have served as worry, beads, or simply mementos of significant places, but it was the journal beside the cross that truly captured her attention. Unlike the maps and official documents she had found elsewhere in the cave, this was deeply personal, a record of thoughts, prayers, and observations written in careful script that spoke of education and contemplation. The first entry she could make out was dated September 15th, 1871. Arrived safely at the sanctuary today. Brother Washington was right about this place. It offers not just physical shelter, but peace for the soul. After so many months of fear and uncertainty, to find a place where we can simply be ourselves without apology or disguise feels like a miracle. As she read further, a picture emerged of the cave as something far more significant than she had initially understood. This wasn't just a mining operation or even a simple refuge. It was a sanctuary in the truest sense, a place where people who had been denied dignity and safety in the outside world could create a community based on mutual respect and shared purpose. The journal entries described daily life in remarkable detail. There were accounts of morning prayers held in the main chamber, with voices raised in hymns that echoed through the stone passages. Descriptions of communal meals, where everyone contributed what they could and shared equally in what was available. Stories of teaching sessions, where those with education passed knowledge to those who had been denied schooling, and where practical skills were shared freely among all members of the community. But perhaps most moving were the accounts of healing that took place here. Not just physical healing, though there were detailed descriptions of herbal remedies and medical care provided to those who arrived sick or injured. The deeper healing was emotional and spiritual, the process of men and women recovering their sense of worth and possibility after experiencing the dehumanizing effects of slavery and its aftermath. One entry, dated November 3rd, 1871, particularly struck her. Today, Brother Samuel spoke of his children, left behind in Alabama when he was forced to flee. He wept as he described their faces, and we all wept with him. But then Sister Mary reminded us that his children are safer because he had the courage to leave, that his sacrifice created space for them to grow up free. This is the burden we carry, choosing exile so that others might have the chance to belong. Miriam found herself thinking of her own mother, who had also made the difficult choice to leave rather than stay in circumstances that offered no future. The parallels between her situation and those of the people who had lived here decades earlier were undeniable, despite the vast differences in historical context. As she explored the individual living areas, she began to understand the extraordinary care that had gone into creating this community. Each person's space reflected their personality and background while contributing to the collective good. There was the workshop area of someone who had clearly been a skilled carpenter, evidenced by the beautiful furniture and storage solutions found throughout the cave. Another area showed the tools and materials of someone who had worked with leather, creating everything from practical items like water containers to decorative pieces that added beauty to daily life. The kitchen area was perhaps the most telling space of all. Here, the evidence of cooperation and mutual care was overwhelming. Multiple cooking areas allowed for the preparation of large communal meals, while careful food storage systems ensured that resources were protected and fairly distributed. Someone had even created a small garden area near the cave entrance, taking advantage of natural seepage to grow herbs and vegetables that supplemented their diet. But it was the children's area that moved her most deeply. In the corner of the main chamber, someone had created a space specifically designed for young ones. Lower shelves stocked with simple toys carved from wood, a collection of picture books carefully wrapped in oiled cloth, even a small sleeping area sized for children. The evidence suggested that this community had included families, that children had grown up in this hidden sanctuary while their parents worked to create a better future. The implications of this discovery were staggering. This wasn't just a story of individual survival. It was evidence of an organized effort to create safe spaces for entire communities. The cave represented something that had been largely erased from official histories, the extraordinary resourcefulness and determination of people who had refused to accept that freedom was impossible. Biscuit had found his own area of interest in what appeared to be a primitive veterinary station. Someone here had clearly possessed knowledge of animal care, evidenced by the collection of tools and remedies stored in careful organization. There were even indications that livestock had been kept in certain areas of the cave system, providing milk, eggs, and other necessities for the community. As the day wore on, Miriam began to piece together the larger story of what had happened here. The dates on various artifacts and documents suggested that the community had thrived for several years, growing and evolving as new members arrived and contributed their skills and knowledge. But then, sometime in the mid-1870s, the evidence of daily life simply stopped. The most recent dated item she could find was from spring 1876, a letter fragment that mentioned increasing dangers and the need to consider our options carefully. After that, nothing. No indication of violence or forced departure, just the careful preservation of belongings, as if everyone had simply walked away, intending to return someday. The mystery of their disappearance only deepened her respect for what they had accomplished. These people had created something extraordinary against impossible odds, had built a community based on principles of mutual aid and dignity that challenged everything the outside world believed about their capabilities and worth. As evening approached and she prepared to spend her first night in the cave, Miriam felt the weight of what she had discovered. She was alone in a place that had once been filled with voices and laughter, prayers and tears, the everyday sounds of people building lives together. The silence was profound, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with the echoes of all who had come before. She carefully returned the wooden cross to its place beside the sleeping area, understanding now that she was not just a visitor, but a temporary guardian of something sacred. These people had entrusted their stories to the stone and silence of this place, and she had been chosen to receive that trust. Tomorrow she would continue her exploration, but tonight she would rest in the same space where others had found safety and hope. She would sleep under the protection of their courage and wake with the responsibility of ensuring their stories would not be forgotten. The hidden journal collection lay behind a false wall that Miriam discovered purely by accident. She had been following Biscuit deeper into the cave system when her shoulder brushed against what appeared to be solid rock. Instead of the expected firmness, the stone gave slightly under pressure, revealing itself to be a carefully constructed facade designed to conceal a natural alcove. Behind the false wall was a treasure more valuable than any gold mine, a complete archive of the community's existence, meticulously organized and preserved with the care of people who understood they were creating a historical record for future generations. Dozens of personal journals, bound correspondence, official documents, and even newspaper clippings filled the hidden space. Each item wrapped in oiled cloth and stored with meticulous attention to preservation. But it was the master journal, bound in leather and bearing the inscription Records of New Providence Settlement 1869 to 1876, that revealed the true scope of what she had discovered. This wasn't just a mining camp or temporary refuge. This was documentation of one of the most remarkable communities in American history, a planned settlement of formerly enslaved people who had created their own version of freedom in the remote Southwest. The Master Journal's opening entry, written in J. Washington's careful script, laid out the community's founding principles with startling clarity. We hereby establish New Providence as a sanctuary for all who seek freedom from oppression, regardless of the color of their skin or the circumstances of their birth. Here we shall govern ourselves according to principles of mutual aid, democratic decision-making, and respect for the dignity of every human soul. As Miriam read deeper into the archives, a picture emerged that challenged everything she thought. She knew about post-Civil War America. New Providence hadn't been founded by random prospectors or desperate fugitives. It had been carefully planned and organized by educated, politically aware individuals who had made the deliberate choice to create an alternative society rather than attempt to find acceptance in the existing one. The settlement's leaders included teachers, ministers, skilled craftsmen, and even former soldiers who had served in the Union Army. They had possessed both the vision to imagine something better and the practical skills to make that vision reality. The journals described a sophisticated system of governance based on consensus decision-making, where every adult member of the community had a voice in determining policies and resolving disputes. But perhaps most remarkably, New Providence had been part of a larger network. The correspondence files revealed connections to similar communities throughout the Southwest and beyond. Letters arrived regularly from settlements in Colorado, New Mexico, and even as far away as California, creating a communication network that shared resources, information, and mutual support. One letter from a community in Colorado, dated August 1873, provided stunning context. Brother Washington, your success at New Providence continues to inspire our work here. We have received 3 more families this month, refugees from the violence in Louisiana, and your methods for organizing communal labor have proven invaluable. The seeds you sent have flourished in our mountain climate, and we are able to share surplus with settlements to the south. The archives revealed that New Providence had been economically self-sufficient, and then some. Beyond the gold mining that had initially supported the community, they had developed agriculture, crafts production, and even a small-scale manufacturing operation. They had traded with Native American communities in the region, establishing relationships based on mutual respect and fair exchange that contrasted sharply with the exploitation and violence that characterized most white Indian interactions of the era. But it was the children's records that most profoundly affected Miriam. Detailed educational records showed that every child in New Providence received comprehensive schooling, including subjects that would have been revolutionary for the time. Girls learned mathematics and science alongside boys. Children of all backgrounds studied together, and the curriculum included African American history and culture alongside traditional subjects. School essays preserved in the archives revealed children who were confident, articulate, and possessed of a sense of possibility that would have been unimaginable for most black children of that era. One essay, written by a 10-year-old named Sarah Freeman in 1874, began, "When I grow up, I want to be a doctor like Dr. Mary, who takes care of everyone in our community. Papa says I can be anything I want to be here in New Providence, and I believe him because I see grown-ups who were never allowed to read when they were children, and now they help teach the younger ones." As she continued reading, Miriam began to understand the tragic scope of what had been lost. New Providence hadn't failed due to internal conflicts or lack of resources. According to the final entries in the Master Journal, the community had been thriving as late as 1876, with plans for expansion and even discussions of sending representatives to advocate for similar communities throughout the territory. The answer to what had happened lay in a collection of newspaper clippings and official documents from late 1876. The election that year had brought an end to Reconstruction, and with it, a systematic campaign to eliminate black political and economic independence throughout the South and West. Federal troops were withdrawn, civil rights protections were abandoned, and local authorities were given free rein to suppress any evidence of black success or self-determination. The final entry in the Master Journal dated November 15, 1876, was written in J. Washington's increasingly urgent script. Federal marshal arrived today with orders to investigate illegal mining operations and unauthorized settlement on federal lands. We know this is pretense. Our land claims are legal and properly filed, our mining operations fully compliant with territorial law, but the law no longer protects us, if it ever did. After much discussion and prayer, we have decided to abandon New Providence rather than risk the safety of our children and families. We will scatter to the four winds, carrying our dreams with us until we can find new soil in which to plant them. The final pages of the journal contain detailed instructions for preserving the site and its archives for future discovery. J. Washington and the other leaders had understood that they were creating historical evidence that would someday be important, that their experiment in freedom needed to be documented for posterity, even if it could not be sustained in their present circumstances. But the most shocking revelation came in a separate journal marked Security Concerns. Here, J. Washington had documented systematic attempts by local authorities and business interests to eliminate successful black communities throughout the territory. New Providence hadn't been unique. It had been one of dozens of such settlements that had been targeted for destruction as part of a deliberate campaign to maintain white economic and political dominance. The journal listed other communities by name with notes about their fate. Blackdom, New Mexico, burned out 1877, families scattered. Liberty Hill, Colorado, residents relocated by federal marshals, location unknown. Freedom Valley, Utah, mining claims invalidated, families forced to abandon homes and equipment. Miriam sat in the hidden archive, surrounded by the carefully preserved evidence of one of American history's greatest tragedies, not just the destruction of these communities, but the systematic erasure of their memory. The history books she had read in school contained no mention of places like New Providence, no acknowledgement that such communities had ever existed. The narrative of post-Civil War America had been written as if the only options for formerly enslaved people had been submission to sharecropping in the South or gradual assimilation into white society in the North. But here was proof that there had been a third way. Communities of people who had refused to accept limited options, who had created their own version of freedom based on principles of equality, mutual aid, and democratic governance. Communities that had succeeded so spectacularly that they had to be destroyed to maintain the fiction that such success was impossible. The implications were staggering. How many other New Providences had existed and been forgotten? How many other hidden archives might be waiting for discovery? How different might American history have been if these experiments in radical democracy had been allowed to flourish, instead of being systematically eliminated? As she carefully returned the journals to their protective wrappings, Miriam realized that her understanding of her discovery had been completely transformed. She hadn't found a lost gold mine. She had found something far more valuable. She had found proof that the America she had been taught to believe in, the America where freedom and equality were gradually but inevitably expanding, was a lie. Tata. Real America was the one that had systematically destroyed communities like New Providence and then erased all evidence of their existence. But it was also the America that had created New Providence in the first place, the America of people who refused to accept injustice, who possessed the vision and courage to create alternatives, who preserved their stories against all odds, so that someday someone like her might find them and understand what had been possible. Standing in that hidden archive, 13-year-old Miriam Tate made a decision that would shape the rest of her life. She would not seek gold or personal profit from this discovery. She would become the guardian of these stories, the keeper of this memory, the voice that would ensure New Providence and communities like it would never be forgotten again. The legal document lay spread across Miriam's kitchen table like a roadmap to redemption. 43 pages of property deeds, historical research citations, and bureaucratic authorizations that had taken her 3 years to assemble. At 67, she had learned that changing the world required as much paperwork as passion, but the stack of documents before her represented something far more significant than legal compliance. It was proof that New Providence would finally receive the recognition and protection it deserved. Dr. Rebecca Martinez sat across from her, reviewing the final pages of the Heritage Site application with the meticulous attention that had made her one of the Southwest's most respected historians. "Miriam, this is extraordinary work. The documentation you've provided is more comprehensive than anything I've seen for sites with 10 times the funding and institutional support. The process of assembling that documentation had consumed the better part of Miriam's retirement, but it had also been the most meaningful work of her life. After spending 30 years as a social worker, helping children navigate systems designed to process rather than protect them, she had finally found a way to channel her personal experience into something that could benefit others. The journey from that 13-year-old girl fleeing into the desert to this moment had been neither straight nor simple. After leaving New Providence that long-ago summer, Miriam had eventually been placed in foster care, graduated high school, and earned a scholarship to Arizona State University. She had studied social work with the intensity of someone who understood systems from the perspective of those they were supposed to serve. But even as she built a successful career helping other displaced children, New Providence had never left her thoughts. She had returned to the site several times over the years, always alone, always with the sense that she was visiting sacred ground that demanded more than personal pilgrimage. The journals and artifacts remained exactly as she had left them, preserved by the desert's dry climate and the site's continued remoteness. It wasn't until her retirement in 2010 that she had finally possessed the time and resources to pursue what had become her life's calling. The first step had been reaching out to Dr. Martinez, whose research on post-Reconstruction Black communities in the Southwest had established her as one of the few academics equipped to understand the significance of Miriam's discovery. Their initial meeting had been electric with mutual recognition. Dr. Martinez had spent years researching fragmentary references to communities like New Providence, piecing together evidence from scattered sources that suggested a much larger network of black settlements than official histories acknowledged. Miriam's preservation of the complete New Providence archives provided the missing piece of a puzzle that historians had been struggling to solve for decades. "The land acquisition documents are particularly impressive," Dr. Martinez continued, indicating a thick section of the application. "Proving legal ownership of the original settlement was crucial for establishing our case with the Park Service. That had been one of the most challenging aspects of the project. The original land claims filed by J. Washington and the other New Providence founders had been carefully researched and properly recorded, but tracking down the legal chain of ownership through nearly 150 years of bureaucratic changes had required the services of a specialized attorney who understood both property law and the complexities of Western land rights. The breakthrough had come when they discovered that the New Providence settlers had been remarkably prescient about protecting their legal interests. J. Washington had filed multiple overlapping claims under different provisions of federal law, creating a legal fortress that had survived even the systematic attempts to invalidate black land ownership during the post-Reconstruction period. More importantly, the settlers had been careful to document their compliance with all applicable regulations. The archives contained copies of mining permits, water rights filings, even territorial tax payments that proved the community had operated entirely within the legal framework of the time. Their destruction had been purely political, not legal, which strengthened the case for federal protection of the site. But the legal documentation was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. Miriam had also spent years building the community support that would make the heritage site sustainable and meaningful. She had reached out to Black historical societies throughout the Southwest, sharing photocopies of key documents and seeking connections to families who might have connections to New Providence residents. The results had been extraordinary. Descendants of New Providence settlers began to emerge from communities across the region, bringing their own family stories and documents that filled in gaps in the historical record. A woman in Denver had preserved letters from her great-grandfather describing his time at New Providence. A family in Los Angeles had kept a wooden trunk containing tools and personal items that their ancestor had carried when he left the settlement. In 1876, each new connection had added weight to the heritage site application, while also creating a growing network of stakeholders invested in the project's success. What had begun as Miriam's personal mission had evolved into a community effort that spanned multiple states and brought together people who had never known their shared history. The emotional preparation for returning to the site had been as challenging as the legal and academic work. Miriam had spent decades processing the trauma of her childhood, the abandonment, the fear, the desperate search for belonging that had driven her into the desert. But confronting those memories in the context of creating something positive and lasting had proven to be profoundly healing. Dr. Martinez had helped her understand that her childhood experience was inextricably linked to the larger historical patterns that had shaped New Providence. The systems that had failed her, the poverty, the family breakdown, the institutional indifference to children in crisis, were the modern descendants of the same forces that had destroyed the black settlements of the 1870s. Your story is part of their story, Dr. Martinez had told her during one of their planning sessions. The courage it took for you to follow that map at 13 years old connects directly to the courage it took for them to create New Providence. In the first place, you were continuing their journey. That perspective had reframed everything about her discovery and her subsequent efforts to preserve it. She wasn't just honoring the memory of people who had died long before her birth. She was completing work that they had begun, ensuring that their vision of freedom and dignity would survive the forces that had temporarily defeated it. The heritage site planning had required her to think carefully about how to present New Providence's story in ways that would resonate with contemporary visitors while maintaining historical accuracy. Working with a team of museum professionals and community historians, they had developed an interpretive plan that would allow visitors to experience the site much as Miriam had discovered it, while providing the context necessary to understand its broader significance. The centerpiece would be the cave system itself, preserved exactly as the settlers had left it, but made accessible to visitors through carefully designed walkways and lighting that wouldn't damage the artifacts. The journals and documents would be displayed in a climate-controlled visitor center, with interactive exhibits that would allow people to explore the settlement's daily life, governance structure, and connections to other communities. But perhaps, most importantly, the site would serve as an educational center for contemporary discussions about freedom, democracy, and community building. New Providence had created something remarkable, not just for its time, but for any time, a society based on radical equality and mutual aid that had succeeded against impossible odds. Their model offered lessons that remained relevant for people, grappling with contemporary challenges of inequality and division. The federal approval process had required multiple site visits, environmental impact studies, and reviews by various expert panels. Each step had brought new challenges and opportunities to refine their vision for the site. Park Service historians had been particularly impressed by the completeness of the archival preservation and the strength of community support for the end project. The final approval had come just 6 months earlier, accompanied by funding that would support both the initial development and ongoing operations of the heritage site. After 3 years of preparation, all the pieces were finally in place for Miriam to return to New Providence, not as a desperate child seeking shelter, but as the leader of an effort to ensure that the community's legacy would endure for future generations. As she looked at the legal documents spread across her table, Miriam felt the weight of both history and hope. The papers represented thousands of hours of work by dozens of people who had committed themselves to preserving a story that had nearly been lost forever. But they also represented the fulfillment of a promise she had made to herself as a 13-year-old girl sitting in a hidden archive, surrounded by the carefully preserved dreams of people who had refused to accept that freedom was impossible. Dr. Martinez gathered the documents into neat stacks, preparing for their departure the following morning. "Are you ready for this, Miriam? Going back after all these years?" Miriam looked out her window toward the desert horizon, where the setting sun was painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere out there, beyond the sleeping giant rock formation, New Providence waited for her return. The cave chambers that had sheltered her during the most desperate period of her life would soon welcome visitors from around the world, people who would learn that America's story was far more complex and hopeful than they had ever imagined. "I've been ready for 53 years, she replied, her voice steady with determination. "It's time to bring them home." The memorial stone lay exactly where Miriam remembered placing it 53 years earlier, a carefully selected piece of red sandstone positioned at the cave entrance with childish solemnity. She had carved "Biscuit, good dog" into its surface with a piece of metal found among the settlers' tools, creating a crude but heartfelt marker for the companion who had led her to this life-changing discovery before succumbing to old age during their final weeks together at the site. Standing before that weathered stone now, surrounded by the controlled chaos of the heritage site construction crew, Miriam felt the full weight of time collapsing around her. The 13-year-old girl who had carved those words with trembling hands seemed to stand beside her, desperate and hopeful in equal measure, while the 67-year-old woman she had become marveled at the journey that had brought her back to this sacred place. Dr. Martinez approached with her ever-present clipboard, her professional excitement barely contained as she gestured toward the teams of workers carefully establishing the infrastructure that would soon make New Providence accessible to the world. The archaeological team finished their preliminary survey of the main chamber yesterday. "Everything is exactly as you described it, Miriam, exactly as you preserved it." The past 3 days had been a whirlwind of activity as the heritage site development officially began. Construction crews worked to build access roads and visitor facilities while maintaining strict protocols to protect the cave system's integrity. Archaeological teams documented every artifact and structural detail. Park Service rangers established security perimeters and visitor management systems. But for Miriam, the most emotionally challenging aspect had been the arrival of community members whose ancestors had lived at New Providence. Watching descendants of the settlement's founders walk through the cave chambers for the first time, seeing their faces as they encountered preserved belongings and personal effects of great-great-grandparents they had only known through family stories, had been both profoundly moving and surprisingly overwhelming. "My great-great-grandmother Sarah Freeman lived here," whispered Marcus Freeman, a computer programmer from Denver whose genealogical research had connected him to the settlement. He knelt beside the sleeping area where Miriam had found the wooden cross, his fingers hovering reverently over belongings that had remained untouched for nearly 150 years. She wrote about this place in letters to her sister. She said it was the first place she ever felt truly free. The presence of the descendants had added layers of complexity that Miriam hadn't fully anticipated. While their enthusiasm and emotional investment enriched the project immeasurably, it also meant that every decision about preservation and presentation carried the weight of family legacy. These weren't just historical artifacts to be displayed, they were cherished heirlooms that had been waiting generations for their families to reclaim them. The construction work itself presented constant challenges. The remote location made every delivery of materials and equipment a logistical puzzle, while the need to preserve the site's historical integrity severely limited the types of modifications that could be made. Everything had to be removable, reversible, and designed to minimize impact on the original structures. More challenging still were the emotional demands of spending extended time at the site. Miriam found herself experiencing flashbacks and anxiety attacks as suppressed memories of her desperate childhood surfaced unexpectedly. The combination of present-day stress and historical trauma created a psychological landscape that required careful navigation. The support team that Dr. Martinez had assembled included a cultural psychologist who specialized in heritage preservation projects. Dr. Elena Vasquez had worked with indigenous communities reclaiming sacred sites and understood the unique emotional challenges that such projects presented for those with personal connections to the locations. "What you're experiencing is completely normal," Dr. Vasquez explained during one of their counseling sessions at the temporary field office. "You're not just returning to a place you visited as a child. You're integrating your personal trauma with your role as a historical preservationist, all while managing the expectations of multiple communities who see you as the guardian of their heritage." The physical demands of the project were equally intense. At 67, Miriam found that spending long days in the desert heat, navigating rough terrain, and maintaining the energy level required for constant decision-making pushed her body to its limits. But she also discovered reserves of strength and endurance that surprised her, as if the site itself was providing the energy she needed to complete this work. The most unexpected challenge came from the local community in the nearest town, where news of the heritage site development had generated mixed reactions. While many residents were excited about the potential economic benefits of increased tourism, others expressed concern about outside interference and changes to their familiar landscape. A town hall meeting had devolved into heated debate when some attendees questioned whether the black settlement story was significant enough to warrant federal protection. Miriam had found herself defending not just the historical importance of New Providence, but the very right of its story to be told and preserved. "These people created something extraordinary," she had told the assembled crowd, her voice steady despite the hostility she sensed in some quarters. "They built a community based on principles that were revolutionary for their time and remain inspiring today. Their story is American history, and it deserves to be preserved and shared." The confrontation had reminded her that the forces that had destroyed New Providence hadn't entirely disappeared, that the work of preserving and celebrating black history still faced resistance in many quarters. But it had also strengthened her resolve and clarified the importance of what they were accomplishing. As evening fell and the construction crews departed for their temporary accommodations in town, Miriam often found herself alone at the site, sitting beside Biscuit's memorial stone and reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her here. The cave chambers that had once sheltered a desperate child now buzzed with the activity of creating something that would benefit countless future visitors. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new progress toward the heritage site's completion. But tonight she would maintain her vigil beside the memorial stone, honoring both the dog who had led her to this discovery and the community whose story would finally be told. The bronze plaque gleamed in the morning sunlight, its polished surface reflecting the faces of the nearly 200 people who had gathered for the official dedication of the New Providence Heritage Site. Mounted on a carefully selected piece of local stone and positioned at the site's entrance, the plaque bore words that Miriam had crafted over months of careful consideration. New Providence Settlement, 1869 to 1876. In this place, formerly enslaved Americans and their allies created a community based on principles of freedom, equality, and mutual aid. Their courage in seeking dignity and self-determination in the face of systemic oppression serves as an enduring inspiration for all who believe in the possibility of justice. Standing before the assembled crowd, descendants of New Providence, residents, historians, government officials, local community members, and visitors who had traveled from across the country, Miriam felt the weight of history and hope settling around her shoulders like a comfortable shawl. The anxious 13-year-old who had stumbled into this place seeking only shelter could never have imagined this moment when the hidden stories of New Providence would finally receive the recognition they deserved. Dr. Martinez approached the microphone that had been set up near the plaque, her voice carrying clearly across the desert air as she began the formal dedication ceremony. Ladies and gentlemen, we gather today not just to dedicate a historical site, but to reclaim a piece of American history that has been too long forgotten. The New Providence settlement represents one of the most remarkable examples of community building and democratic governance in the post-Civil War era. The ceremony had been planned to honor both the historical significance of the site and the contemporary efforts that had made its preservation possible. Representatives from the National Park Service spoke about the rigorous process of evaluation that had led to federal recognition. Academic historians placed New Providence in the broader context of Reconstruction-era Black communities. Descendants of the original settlers shared family stories that had been passed down through generations, but it was Miriam's speech that would anchor the day's meaning. As she approached the microphone, she looked out at faces that reflected the diversity of America itself, black and white, young and old, local residents and international visitors, all united by their presence at this moment of historical reclamation. 53 years ago, she began, her voice steady and clear, I was a desperate 13-year-old girl with nowhere to go and no one to depend on except a scruffy dog named Biscuit. When that dog led me to this place, I thought I was looking for gold. What I found instead was something far more precious, proof that freedom is not something that can be granted or taken away, but something that people create for themselves, through courage, vision, and mutual support. She paused, allowing her words to settle over the audience before continuing. The people of New Providence didn't wait for the world to change around them. They changed it themselves, one decision at a time, one day at a time, one act of courage at a time. They created a community where every voice mattered, where education was valued, where children could grow up believing they could become anything they dreamed of being. The emotional weight of the moment was palpable as Miriam's voice grew stronger with each sentence. But their story doesn't end in 1876 when they were forced to abandon this place. It continues in every effort to create justice and equality, in every person who refuses to accept that things have to be the way they've always been, in every community that chooses cooperation over competition, inclusion over exclusion. Marcus Freeman, the descendant who had been so moved by his first visit to the site, stepped forward to present Miriam with a special recognition from the Descendants Committee. Ms. Tate, our families want you to know that you've given us back something we thought was lost forever. You've given us back our ancestors' voices, their dreams, their proof that freedom is possible when people work together to create it. The formal dedication concluded with the unveiling of additional interpretive markers throughout the site, each one providing context for different aspects of New Providence's history and connecting the settlement's story to broader themes in American history. Visitors could now follow a carefully designed trail that would take them through the cave system, the remnants of the agricultural areas and the workshop spaces where the community had created both art and necessity. But perhaps the most moving moment came when Dr. Vasquez, the cultural psychologist who had worked with Miriam throughout the development process, spoke about the healing power of historical preservation. What we celebrate today is not just the preservation of a historical site, but the restoration of narrative justice. The people of New Providence left behind more than artifacts and documents. They left behind proof that democracy and freedom are not abstract concepts, but lived experiences that require constant creation and protection. As the formal ceremony concluded and visitors began exploring the site in smaller groups, Miriam found herself standing once again beside Biscuit's memorial stone. The bronze plaque was visible from this spot, its formal language a stark contrast to the childish carving that had marked her first attempt to honor this place and its meaning. Dr. Martinez joined her in the comfortable silence that had become familiar during their years of collaboration. "How does it feel, Miriam, seeing it complete?" Miriam considered the question as she watched families walking through the cave entrance, children listening intently as adults shared stories about the courage and vision of those who had come before. "It feels like completion," she said finally. "Not just of the project, but of something that started when I was 13 years old and didn't know how to put words to what I was feeling." The bronze plaque would remain here long after she was gone, telling the story of New Providence to visitors who would find their own meaning in the community's example. Some would be inspired by the democratic governance, others by the economic cooperation, still others by the simple fact that people who had been denied dignity and respect had created a place where both were abundant. But for Miriam, the plaque represented something even more personal. Proof that the frightened child who had found refuge here had grown into someone capable of ensuring that refuge would be available to others, not just physically but spiritually, through the power of stories that refused to be forgotten. The new map spread across Miriam's desk was hand-drawn with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized J. Washington's original. But this one told a different story. Where his map had marked a route to safety and shelter, hers marked a trail of healing and hope that would guide future generations to understanding. Each landmark was annotated not just with practical information, but with the stories that gave the landscape meaning. 2 years had passed since the dedication ceremony, and the New Providence Heritage Site had exceeded everyone's expectations for both visitation and impact. More than 50,000 people had walked the trails that Miriam had helped design, each carrying away their own piece of the settlement's legacy. School groups arrived weekly, children wide-eyed as they explored the cave chambers and listened to stories about young people not so different from themselves who had grown up believing they could change the world. But it was the individual visitors who touched Miriam most deeply. The elderly woman from Alabama who wept as she read the settlers' journals, recognizing in their words the struggles of her own grandparents. The young teacher from Chicago who spent hours in the educational center, gathering materials to share with her students. The family from Mexico whose children asked thoughtful questions about community building and democratic decision-making. Each visitor added to Miriam's understanding of why this work mattered. New Providence wasn't just a historical curiosity. It was a living example of possibility that spoke to contemporary challenges and dreams. In a world increasingly divided by politics and prejudice, the settlement's model of radical inclusion and cooperative governance offered both inspiration and practical guidance. Miriam had officially accepted the position of site curator and chief historian, a role that allowed her to shape how New Providence's story was told while continuing to uncover new aspects of its history. Recent archaeological work had revealed additional structures and artifacts, each adding depth to their understanding of how the community had functioned. Correspondence with other heritage sites had led to the discovery of similar communities throughout the Southwest, creating a network of historical preservation that honored the broader pattern of Black self-determination in the post-Civil War era. The research had become deeply personal in ways she hadn't anticipated. Genealogical work conducted by Dr. Martinez had revealed that Miriam's own family history intersected with the New Providence story in unexpected ways. Her great-grandfather, a man she had known only through faded photographs and fragmentary family stories, had been part of the underground network that had supported communities like New Providence with supplies and information. The discovery had reframed her childhood experience in profound ways. Her journey to New Providence hadn't been random coincidence. It had been part of a family legacy of seeking freedom and safety that stretched back generations. The courage that had driven her into the desert at 13 years old was the same. Courage that had motivated her ancestors to support the creation of places like New Providence. "It's like you were always meant to find this place," Dr. Martinez had told her when they made the genealogical connection. "Your family was part of the network that kept New Providence alive, and you became the person who brought it back to life." The new map she was creating would serve multiple purposes. It would guide visitors through the heritage site itself, but it would also connect New Providence to the broader landscape of freedom and resistance that had shaped the American Southwest. Other communities, other stories, other examples of people who had refused to accept limited options, all of them part of a larger pattern that mainstream history had overlooked or deliberately obscured. But perhaps most importantly, the new map was designed to inspire contemporary action. Alongside historical information, it included contact details for organizations working on issues that connected to New Providence's legacy: voting rights, economic justice, community organizing, educational equity. The settlement's founders had understood that freedom required constant creation and protection. Miriam wanted visitors to understand that their responsibility didn't end with appreciation of the past. The evening ritual had become central to her life at the site. As the last visitors departed and the desert settled into the peaceful silence that she remembered from her childhood, Miriam would walk the trails one more time, checking on details and simply being present in the landscape that had shaped her so profoundly. Tonight, she carried the new map with her as she made her way to Biscuit's memorial stone. The bronze plaque was visible in the gathering darkness, its formal language a testament to how far they had all come from that desperate morning when a scrappy dog had started digging in the sand behind an abandoned train depot. She sat beside the memorial stone, spreading the new map across her lap and studying the careful annotations that marked not just physical landmarks, but emotional and spiritual waypoints in the journey from desperation to hope. The sleeping giant rock formation was there, of course, but now it was identified as a symbol of endurance and patience rather than just a navigation marker. The Cottonwood Grove was marked as a place of renewal and community gathering. The cave entrance was noted as a threshold between worlds, the world of struggle and the world of possibility. At the center of the map, she had drawn New Providence itself in careful detail, but surrounded by arrows pointing outward in all directions. The settlement hadn't been an endpoint but a beginning, a proof of concept that had spawned countless other efforts to create justice and community. The arrows represented all the journeys that had begun here, the descendants who had carried the community's values to new places, the visitors who had been inspired to create positive change in their own communities, the young people who had learned that they were part of a legacy of courage that extended both backward and forward in time. The new map would be distributed to schools, community centers, and other heritage sites throughout the region. But more than that, it would serve as a model for how historical preservation could connect past and present, how stories of struggle and triumph could inspire contemporary action. As she folded the map and prepared to return to her small residence on the site grounds, Miriam felt the deep satisfaction that comes from work well done and purpose clearly fulfilled. The frightened 13-year-old who had followed a treasure map into the desert had become the woman who created new maps for others to follow, maps that led not to gold, but to understanding, not to wealth, but to wisdom. The desert night was full of familiar sounds and comfortable silences. Somewhere in the darkness, other young people were probably struggling with challenges that seemed insurmountable, just as she had all those years ago. But now, there was new providence to remind them that freedom was possible, that community could be created, that courage and vision could transform even the most desperate circumstances into opportunities for growth and service. The bronze plaque gleamed faintly in the starlight, its words a promise that these stories would continue to be told, these lessons would continue to be shared, these examples of possibility would continue to inspire all who needed proof that change was not only possible, but inevitable when people were willing to work together to create it. The new map rustled gently in the evening breeze, ready to guide the next generation of travelers toward their own discoveries of what freedom could mean when it was actively created rather than passively awaited. And in that rustling, Miriam could almost hear the voices of all who had come before, whispering their encouragement across the years. Keep going, keep building, keep believing. The journey continues.